For 4 long years during the Second World War, Britain remained an isolated fortress, the final bastion on the edges of Western Europe that had stood against the onslaught of the Nazis as they stormed across the continent in the summer of 1940. Now, as the sun set on the evening of the 5th of June 1944, a mighty armada, the greatest ever seen, set forth on both sea and in the air. Their destination was the coast of Normandy in northern France. The liberation of Europe was about to begin. The English Channel is the busiest shipping lane in the world, but 60 years ago it was much busier. As the soldiers and sailors on those ships rocking up and down on that filthy morning on the 6th of June 1944 looked out, they could see from horizon to horizon the channel covered with the biggest armada the world had ever seen. No less than 6,000 ships were sailing across here with balloons and aeroplanes as Admiral Ramsay, the hero of Dunkirk, launched the greatest maritime armada ever. There were no less than 6 battleships accompanying the force. Ahead of them, 200 minesweepers cleared a channel to the French coast. And the whole operation was totally successful. At the end of that filthy day, the armada had actually put 145,000 men ashore, thousands of tanks and guns and vehicles for almost minimal loss. Operation Neptune, the maritime operation for D-Day, was a huge success. In June 1940, British forces had been chased off the continent at Dunkirk. Although most of their equipment had to be left behind, nearly 250,000 men were rescued, men who would one day provide the backbone of a new, better trained and better equipped force, ready to strike back at the continent of Europe. The planning for that fight back started within a year of the British ignominious retreat from Dunkirk.
We believe that the Nazis and the fascists have asked for it, and they're going to get it.
With the re-election of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940, the involvement of the United States in the war took on a new dimension, even though America was still officially neutral. In January 1941, the Lease-Lend Bill was introduced into Congress, giving Britain access to America's massive industrial capability. A series of secret meetings between British and American military staffs followed, with the aim of developing the strategy for the conduct of what became known as the War against the Axis Powers. Defeating Germany in Europe was to be given priority. To this end, forces would be built up in Britain to enable an offensive to be launched against Germany, together with a relentless bombardment from the air. But following the talks in Washington, the war took a dramatic turn. First, in June 1941, Germany invaded its former ally, Stalin's USSR. Then in December that year, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, followed by Hitler's astonishing declaration of war against the United States. Although Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin all agreed that Germany and Japan had to be beaten, there was much dissent and argument among the Allies as to how this end could be achieved. Stalin was obviously eager there should be a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on the Red Army. The Americans also wanted a quick resolution in Europe so they could turn their attention to Japan. Churchill, on the other hand, wanted to continue his campaign in North Africa and then attack southern Italy, Europe's soft underbelly, as he eloquently described it. But Churchill also recognized it was important to keep the Russians in the war, and opening a second front on continental Europe was the only way that the pressure on the Soviet Union could be relieved. It was against this backdrop that Britain mounted its first amphibious operation in August 1942. The target was Dieppe. The raiding party was made up mainly of Canadian units and the recently formed commandos. The operation, codenamed Jubilee, was only meant to be an experiment, but the Dieppe raid turned out to be a monumental disaster. The element of surprise was lost when the operation was postponed for a month, giving German reconnaissance aircraft enough time to record the build-up of the landing craft. Air cover was patchy to say the least, and the RAF failed to get air supremacy. Even worse, the tanks bogged down on the pebbles on the beach as they came ashore, thus denying the infantry the heavy fire support they needed. But lessons were learned from the fiasco at Dieppe, which would serve the Allies well in their subsequent planning for the landings in northern France. 3 months later, in November 1942, the first major Allied landings in North Africa took place. Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa, coincided with a successful Russian counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, which forced the Germans onto the strategic defensive for the very first time in the war. Final victory in North Africa in May 1943 paved the way for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. But these invasions, coupled with the increase of the bombing campaign against German industry, did little to placate an increasingly irate Stalin. Only the opening of a second front in Western Europe would divert sufficient forces from the east to relieve the pressure on the Red Army. In May 1943, the proposed invasion of Western Europe was finally given its name, Operation Overlord. And by January 1944, a supreme commander had been appointed, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower appointed British commanders to oversee the Allied invasion forces on land, sea and air. General Bernard Law Montgomery, the victor of El Alamein, was given command of the ground invasion forces. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the hero of Dunkirk, was appointed naval commander, and Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory was to head the Expeditionary Air Forces. Although Normandy had already been chosen as the invasion site, one of Montgomery's first acts was to increase the size and scope of the invasion force on the first day. He demanded, and he got, 5 divisions for the initial landings and widened the area of the landings to include the Orne River estuary on the eastern flank and the base of the Cotentin Peninsula on the western flank. The invasion force itself was to consist of 5 infantry divisions, 2 American, 2 British and 1 Canadian. They were to land west to east on beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword. In addition, 2 American airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, were to land behind the western edge of the assault area in the area of Saint-Mary-Église, while 1 British airborne division, the 6th, was to drop on objectives on the eastern end and the Orne River. As training intensified, the build-up of reserves of men and equipment continued to flow in from the United States. The convoys still had to run the gauntlet of the U-boat threat, even though the danger was not as great as it once had been. By January 1944, there were some 750,000 American personnel in the United Kingdom. By D-Day, this had swollen to 1.5 million men. Much of southern Britain became one enormous military camp. Almost the entire coastline, from the Wash to Land's End, for some 10 miles inland, became a strictly controlled military or even no-go area. It meant that in some villages, the civilian populations were forcibly evacuated to make room for military personnel. And yet, the British people just took it all in their stride. After 4 years of hardship, sacrifice, rationing, and generally having to go without, a little more discomfort seemed to be of little consequence, especially if it brought peace and an end to a debilitating war. The beaches of the West Country provided the perfect location for rehearsing the infantry landings, many of whom would be going into action for the very first time. But on April the 28th, 1944, a large-scale practice assault at Slapton Sands in Devon went badly wrong. A raiding party of German torpedo boats stumbled across the exercise and managed to get in among the landing craft laden with troops. In the chaos that followed, they managed to sink a number of vessels, killing nearly 900 men, Winning air superiority was of vital importance in the months before D-Day. The British and American strategic bomber forces were diverted from their pounding of German cities into attacking targets that would disrupt the German ability to mount an effective defence in France. Between April and the beginning of June 1944, 11,000 aircraft flew nearly 200,000 sorties. They attacked French rail centres and road networks, as well as German airfields and radar stations, and military bases, and coastal artillery batteries. The submarine base at Lorient in western Brittany also received special attention from the bombers. The ships of the invasion force had to be able to cross the channel unhindered by any attacks from the dreaded U-boats. All the bridges across the Seine and the Loire rivers were destroyed, thus isolating the Normandy battlefield area from the rest of France. But there was a cost. Some 2,000 aircraft were lost during these raids, but the sacrifice of the crews was not in vain. For the air campaign served another, much more subtle purpose. Of the nearly 200,000 tons of bombs dropped between April and June, no less than 2/3 were dropped outside the invasion area. This was all part of a great deception plan that was as thoroughly planned and executed as the invasion plan itself. All efforts were directed to convincing the Germans that the invasion would happen northeast of the Seine, preferably in the Pas-de-Calais area. It was the obvious choice, as the closest landfall to Kent. It was also well within aircraft range. Also, seizing Calais would provide access to a port, and that could be vital for offloading fresh supplies of men and equipment. To complete the deception, a complete phantom army was created under the command of American General George S. Patton, then in disgrace. Whole fields in Kent were transformed into giant tank parks. Unfortunately, most of the tanks were inflatable dummies. Communications traffic between Patton's virtually non-existent general staff was made as intense as possible, as it was made easy for the Germans to intercept. This latter task was made much easier because the German spy networks in Britain had been completely infiltrated, in fact controlled, by the British intelligence services. By this time of the war, the Germans had allowed their intelligence gathering capability degrade to such an extent that they were almost unable to make significant use of any good intelligence that did fall into their hands. But the deception plan was so successful that the Germans continued to believe that Calais was the real objective, even after the landings in Normandy had begun. An entire army was held back in the Pas-de-Calais until July 1944, just in case a second, larger Allied invasion force should land. There were even those among the Allies who felt that Calais would have proved the better choice. It was, after all, the shortest sea route, near enough for sustained fighter cover, and it was the shortest route to the heart of Germany. But it was too obvious and very strongly defended. A great amount of effort was therefore spent by the Allies in finding an alternative before settling on the beaches of Normandy. Other sites, such as Brittany, were too far away by sea, and forces landing on the Cotentin Peninsula could easily be cut off and isolated. One of the lessons of Dieppe had been that critical to the success of any amphibious landing would be getting armour ashore onto the beaches as part of the very first assault waves. To do this, a fleet of special tanks was created under the leadership of a retired general, Percy Hobart. Under his enthusiastic command, engineers devised some very ingenious and new weapons. For example, clearing paths through minefields on the beaches would need to be done quickly as possible to get the troops inshore. Special tanks equipped with flails, driven by the tank's engine, proved to be a simple but effective solution. Another problem was how to get armour and heavy trucks off the landing craft without them becoming bogged down in the soft sand of the beaches. Again, a tank carrying a large roll of canvas matting solved the problem. Other tanks with special weapons were devised to deal with the problem of deeply entrenched defences by the Germans just inshore. The Crocodile tank was fitted with a trailer containing fuel so that it could bathe a position or a German gun post with a jet of burning petrol. Another particularly effective weapon used by the engineers storming the beaches was the replacement of a tank's normal 2-pounder or 6-pounder main gun with a huge 150mm mortar, again devastating, throwing a dustbin of explosive right against a concrete bunker. But the biggest challenge of all was how to get the first tanks onto the beach in the first place. What was needed were tanks that could swim their way to shore using their own power.
And after about 3 or 4 weeks, during which I was introduced, to my troop and the other officers, we went off to Essex on the Fritton Lakes, where we were told that we were going to be involved with a swimming tank, which at the time seemed extraordinary to us. But we were soon introduced to this machine, which happened to be a Valentine, which carried a 2-pounder gun and was quite a small tank. And we were introduced to the concept of it being able to float. And this was tested out on a lake, Fritton Lakes, and involved a screen around the skirt of the tank, which was inflated so that as one went into the water, the screen protected the tank on the principle of Archimedes, and it was thus able to float. And at the back of the tank, at the back of the hull, there were propellers which turned and therefore enabled us to be mobile. But it wasn't the easiest experience at the start. When we'd finished with Fritton Lakes and the Valentines, we were issued with Shermans and did sort of dummy runs down a sort of slope into the sea, first of all, and sort of moved around a bit and then came back to land. And thereafter, of course, it wasn't long before we were actually involved with the LCT itself. And, exercises in a serious vein then began.
Meanwhile, in France itself, the French resistance also had important roles. Large quantities of arms and explosives were parachuted into France so that when the call came, a line of 18th century verse broadcast over the BBC, the resistance fighters would rise up and disrupt German communications and so add further confusion to the invasion when it came.
It must have been 2 or 3 months before D-Day. I was sent to what they were called CAE, that was Commander Airborne Establishments at Salisbury. And I had to go from there to Bushy, Bletchley, Chigwell, and take a course of French and wireless telegraphy, and I had to sort of pass through with that, and then they told us what our job would be. We were going with 4 deceivers, as they called them, and it was to give out duff information. They were Frenchmen, to give out duff information to German units. If any one of the group was likely to be caught, captured or ill, or we couldn't carry on with the operation, we were to send the signal AR, AR, AR in Morse code, which we were. And then we had to make sure that the other chaps, the 4 Frenchmen, didn't fall into German hands, that's all. And we had to get them out of it, or whatever.
These French resistance fighters were taking a huge personal risk. As if they were caught, it was unlikely the normal rules of war would apply. In one instance, a whole village was wiped out, not because the inhabitants had any direct involvement with resistance activities, but because, as far as the Germans were concerned, it sent out a harsh warning to others. 4 days after the invasion, on June the 10th, 1944, 2nd SS Panzer arrived at Oradour-sur-Glane. They rounded up all the women and children. They were locked in a church, and the men were then taken in groups to barns and shot. Hitler's Panzer Division then set fire to the church. Since the entry of America into the war, the Germans knew that an invasion was inevitable. They just didn't know when or where it would come. Ever since the Germans' abortive invasion of Britain in the summer of 1940, they'd always had coastal defences up by the Pas de Calais. But once America entered the war in 1941, Hitler decided that he needed to turn his ill-gotten empire into a fortress Europa, Festung Europa. To do this, he decided to build a huge line of defences all along the northwestern coast of France, from Calais right round to Brest. These were built by the Todt organisation. That was the German engineering and construction organisation that had built the Autobahnen. And from the middle of 1943 onwards, hundreds of thousands of slave labourers came here and poured concrete, building batteries, emplacing guns. However, when Rommel arrived here in January 1944, he found that it still hadn't been finished, and the Atlantic Wall was actually not in the state of repair it should have been, considering an invasion was imminent. And with Rommel's typical energy, he went around putting his effort into building the first line of beach defences, because there were 3 lines of defence in the Atlantic Wall. Down on the beach, there were obstacles, mines on sticks, metal poles, anything to slow soldiers and tanks coming ashore. Immediately behind them on the cliff tops were batteries like this one at Longers, a 155mm gun capable of covering the whole of the invasion beach out to a depth of 5 or 6 miles. And there were 15,000 of these emplacements all along the Atlantic Wall. Behind these were a 3rd line of defence, further inland, consisting of mobile divisions that could rush to plug any breach in the great fortress that was Hitler's Europe. Sadly, like all fixed defences, the Atlantic Wall, once it was pierced, was redundant. This battery here at Longers held out till the end of D-Day and was then destroyed by shelling. The Allies came ashore, and all the effort, all the money, all the men, all the time that went into the Atlantic War was wasted. Another factor that was to seriously undermine the Germans' ability to mount a decisive defence was the almost Byzantine command structure that existed within the German forces in France. In overall command in France was General Karl von Rundstedt, but the arrival of Erwin Rommel to take command of Army Group B soon led to a series of disputes between himself and von Rundstedt. Although Rommel and von Rundstedt held the same rank, von Rundstedt was a senior commander, but Rommel had Hitler's ear. Central to their dispute was Rommel's belief that the invasion would come in the Pas de Calais. As Rommel's brief was to prevent an invasion, he demanded control of the elite Panzer armoured reserve forces so that they could be moved nearer to the beaches. He believed that if the Allies could not be pushed straight back into the sea the moment they landed, then the war for Nazi Germany was as good as lost. Von Rundstedt was not so convinced and argued for retaining the panzers nearer to Paris so they could be deployed more quickly to wherever the Allied landing took place. He argued that any foothold the Allies might gain would soon be lost in the face of a counterstroke by superior German armour. Rommel countered by arguing that Allied air superiority meant that the panzers would probably be destroyed before they even reached the front line. Both men appealed to Hitler for a solution. Although he had an almost feminine intuition that the landings would be made in Normandy, he was persuaded otherwise by the army commanders. In the end, Hitler settled for a compromise solution that was probably the worst all round. Some of the divisions were placed under Rommel's command, others under von Rundstedt, while the rest remained, as before, under direct control of the Führer, 1,000 miles away in East Prussia. These delays in mobilizing the panzers would have a decisive effect on the outcome of D-Day. Meanwhile, rehearsals continued in England. Key to the success of the landings was the silencing of the artillery batteries that guarded the beaches, as well as blocking the routes that any reinforcements might take trying to push inland. The task of securing these key sites on the flanks was given to the airborne forces of the American 82nd and 101st and the British 6th Airborne Division. One of the most critical targets on the eastern flank were the bridges that crossed the Orne River and the Caen Canal to the east of Caen. In great secrecy, the assault forces practiced for their critical task.
We've been so trained, we've been trained on some bridges down by Exeter, the Countess Ware Bridge is just outside Exeter, and we've been so trained and drilled on this. We've done battle after battle on these bridges. Again, we were taken there in a secret convoy, closed, sealed up lorries so nobody knew who we were, and we weren't let out until it was dark so that the locals wouldn't know what was happening. And then we had to battle for these bridges at Exeter in exactly the same way as we had to the ones in Normandy, and we were actually put up against Poles on the bridges at Exeter, and they fought like mad because they didn't want us to win their bridges.
The objectives of the 8th Para-Battalion were to drop the furthest inland of all the British and Canadian assault forces on D-Day, and we were to be dropped 8 miles from the coast at a place called Touffreville. Our objectives were to cover the parachute squadron of the Royal Engineers, the 3rd Parachute Squadron, whilst they blew up the bridges at Troarn and at Bure. Now at Troarn there was one masonry bridge carrying the main road from Caen to Rouen. At Bure there was a road bridge and a railway bridge, and both the bridges at Bure were very strongly constructed of lattice iron girder work. After we'd done that, we were to withdraw to the woods nearby and hold that area by active patrolling until the main forces relieved us.
Finally, the stage was set for the greatest invasion the world has ever seen. On the 17th of May, the Supreme Commander, Eisenhower, finally committed to June the 5th as the unalterable date for the invasion of Normandy. The troops were assembled into transit camps, sealed off, and all communication with the outside world cut to achieve the ultimate state of security. The last weeks of May were tense days, and the troops had to occupy their time in these sealed camps as best they could.
Well, we were very busy making sure that the waterproofing was right. You know, that the engine was working and that the lifting of the screen apparatus was working. And we were pretty methodical about this because, I mean, we knew if we weren't going to do it, I mean, we would be in trouble. So a lot of the time was spent, you know, getting ready. And of course we had to have load all the ammunition, the rations, and everything else that, you know, is required on a tank in order to sort of live and put everything into operation. So it was a fairly busy time, but it was something we took pretty seriously. As it transpired later, I mean, we had to exist for many days, you know, because we were in the middle of a battle or a war, and you know, there was no way of getting out of it. So, you know, 3-4 days one could be lodged in a tank without much rest and with not a lot to eat. So that was the strain.
But bad weather began to set in, threatening dangerous landing conditions as the day of the invasion loomed nearer. After tense debates with the staff, Eisenhower finally agreed to a 24-hour postponement, even though the landing craft were loaded with troops and ready to go.
I mean, it was June the 4th, and it was quite a sunny day. And so we were told, you know, we're embarking this evening. And it was a nice evening, and so we duly, you know, reversed up the ramp. I was the last to get on because I was going to be at the sharp end, if you see what I mean. And we just went aboard, I mean, quite comfortably. And then, of course, the weather broke very badly. I mean, as you know, I mean, historically, I mean, the thing had to be postponed from the 5th to the 6th. And then it was uncomfortable. I mean, you know, there was no sort of cover over the LCT. You know, it was rather like a shoebox. And so we had to try and put up what tarpaulins we had to sort of keep most of the rain out. And we got very wet. And then, of course, it got rough, so the people were being sick. So you were sort of wandering around in inches of sick and seawater and not feeling that you wanted to eat much yourself. So that was an uncomfortable little period. And then, of course, on the evening of the 5th, we had to start on our way.
Then, on the morning of the 5th of June, having been assured of a break in the awful weather and the storms in the Channel, Eisenhower finally took the vital decision. "Okay," he said to the assembled staff, "we go." Within hours, an armada of 500 naval vessels, from escort destroyers to battleships, 2,500 other ships, plus 3,000 landing craft, fully loaded, set out for the coast of Normandy.
When I first got into the glider, in fact, I mean, we sat around for quite a long time before that on the runway waiting to get on. I think all of us, we were getting extremely nervous, and I was getting very frightened, I don't mind telling you, because they told us that they were going to send 150 fighting men plus 30 Royal Engineers into capture these two bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. And we thought, God, we're going to be in there, 150 of us, facing the might of the German army. And I thought, well, to do that, even in the sort of best of conditions, was going to be bad. And we were going to do a drop just after midnight onto rough farmland, where intelligence reports only a few days before had come in and said that Rommel had been there and instructed the local people to put up these huge telegraph-type poles, which we called Rommel's asparagus, and they reckoned that if a flimsy glider hit one of those, it would literally disintegrate as it hit the ground, and we normally hit the ground between 80 and 100 miles an hour, so you know, they were very, very flimsy vehicles. It didn't take much for a wing to come off, even at the best of times. And they said, right, well, we're going to put 3 of you down on one bridge and 3 are going down on another one, and off you go, sort of thing. And I got in my glider and I was so frightened. I was 19, and when I strapped myself in, my teeth started chattering, my knees were knocking, and I had my rifle between my knees, and I was gripping my rifle and thinking, if I grip this hard enough, I shan't have my knees knocking at least. And I was so frightened. I really was. I was petrified, because I thought, well, God, we've got no chance. You know, you're going to take us over, 28 men to each glider. They're going to take us over, dump us down in France and leave us there. And we knew that we wouldn't get any backup for at least an hour. And they were saying, right, well, off you go then, and good luck to you, sort of thing. And but it was queer, and I've never understood this, and I've written about it, and I've mentioned it to people, I've mentioned it to psychologists, but I've never understood. I was literally terrified when I was sitting there, and yet the very moment that glider took off and left the ground, I completely changed, and I've never understood this, and some of the other lads have sort of commented on as well, but I literally felt on top of the world, and I sort of felt so pleased, and it was almost as if I was drunk. And I thought, oh, I'm not frightened at all. I'm going to look forward to this, I'm going to enjoy this. And after that, I never was frightened right throughout the war.
Overhead, 822 aircraft carrying parachutists or towing gliders roared through the night. Other strike aircraft began their sorties. In all, 13,000 aircraft would support D-Day by the end of the 6th of June.
In the aircraft flying across, it was a very, very sort of unreal feeling. We knew that we were going to start the war, but in France, but it didn't seem quite real.
Well, I didn't get seasick, fortunately, so I was all right from that point of view. No, my problem was that they kept, wanting to give us rum, and with the smell of vomit all around, I've never been able to drink rum since. There's that sort of indelible awfulness about it.
about 20 minutes, I think, before we were due to jump. We stood up and checked all our equipment and made sure that everybody was hooked up. And then, shortly afterwards, we crossed the coast and the lights went out. It was in total darkness in the plane, in the cabin. And the flak started coming up and the plane started taking evasive action, throwing us about, and the flak was rattling the plane like a tin can.
We'd hardly been underway any time at all, and the glider pilot said we approached the French coast. We thought, well, you didn't need to tell us that. God, the whole sky was like an enormous firework display. There was sort of stuff going up, 20mm shells and multicoloured tracer. The whole sky was a great sort of wall of fire.
If you'd been a German sentry here on the night of the 5th of June 1944, you'd have been pretty uneasy. There's a lot going on that night. Everywhere around in the darkness, there were unusual flashes as shells and bombs were landing. He'd have seen bursts of tracer going up into the air, and above everything, the roar of hundreds of Allied aeroplanes coming over, unseen in the dark. The chances are the bloke doing this was a pretty ordinary sort of guy. He might have been a middle-aged German, perhaps come in from the Eastern Front having been wounded. He might even have been a Russian or a Pole, reluctantly conscripted to serve in Hitler's Nazi legions. His job that night was to guard this vital bridge over the River Orne. Now, this is just one of many bridges, and the River Orne is a very wide river, but it's very important because the River Orne guards the whole eastern flank of the landings, and it was absolutely vital that these bridges were seized to stop the Germans using them to bring in reinforcements from 80 miles away in the Pas-de-Calais, where all the tanks were concentrated, waiting for the landing that would never come. If that armour had burst in on this side of the landing, it would have been a disaster for the landing. The bridges had to be seized intact. The task of seizing this particular bridge at Ronville had been given to Major John Howard and the glider-borne men of D Company, the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry.
So we flew through this quiet zone, dropped off at 6,000 feet just over the coast and went down into a very steep dive. Then we did two stark right-hand turns and then came into the bridges from the south. And it was a fairly bumpy old ride because, well, we knew it would be. We lost the wheels almost as soon as we hit the ground, and then the skids came in, and there were great showers of sparks coming up all over the place. And then there was a God almighty bang like a clap of thunder and a giant sheet being ripped apart, and I was going about all over in half a dozen directions at once. We were only wooden seats and fairly light strapping to keep us in place, and we were bouncing about all over the place, and then eventually it came to a halt and there was total silence. It's most weird. I mean, people can't imagine that, but I honestly, and I said at the time, and it's been put in several books, I honestly thought we must all be dead.
The first sign our nervous German sentry might have had that something was going badly wrong was the almost silent whoosh of three large Horsa gliders crash landing on this exact spot. The first glider's nose actually landed here. It burst through the German barbed wire and sparks flew everywhere. And the German sentry's jaw must have dropped as out of it, as the doors flew off, came 30 armed men with blackened faces, armed to the teeth, and their task was to seize the bridge before the Germans even knew they'd landed. It was a classic coup de main, silent, fast and deadly.
But we've been so trained, I mean, as far as I was concerned, I only had one thing in my mind. I wasn't bothered. There was a machine gun firing across the other side. An old Dan Brotheridge, who was my platoon commander, was just up ahead of me, and there were two or three others up ahead. And we've been so trained, the only thing that you had in mind was that you had to get across that bridge, and as far as our section was concerned, fan off the left. So we finished up on the bank of the canal right outside the Café Gondry, and some of them fanned off to the right. And that was what we were told, that's what we'd been trained to do, and we just did it, and we didn't sort of think any more about it. And then we started scraping a hole in the ground with our little shell scrape things. They were little tools about that size with a head about that big and a little pick about that. And we had to hack a hole in the ground to try and get our bodies in so we were just below ground level. And we were still doing that, and we suddenly heard these damn tanks coming.
Pegasus Bridge, as the bridge at Ranville is now known, and the Café Gondry were the very first places in France to be liberated on the night of the 5th and 6th of June 1944. But these airborne troops were only lightly armed, so any counterattack by the Germans could jeopardise the security of the eastern flank.
And these tanks were started up to come and investigate, and they were literally about 50 yards behind me. I was sort of laying down on this ground, and these damn things suddenly came squealing along, and we thought, oh God, no, tanks, we got nothing to stop them. I mean, we couldn't carry any sort of anti-tank weapon. The only thing we had was a little, it wasn't handheld, it was on a bipod, but a little thing that was called a Piat, and it was projectile infantry anti-tank, it was called. Used to fire a little fat fin-tail bomb, and its maximum distance was about 50 yards or more. So, you know, if you fired that thing and missed the tank, which you quite often did, because it wasn't accurate anyway, and if you missed the tank and it exploded somewhere else, the tank just turned around and blasted you away. And we were sort of thinking, God, what are we going to do? And I didn't even know we'd found a Piat because there's so much wreckage in the gliders. Some of the stuff that we brought down was totally wrecked in the crash. And Wagger Thornton, who was a sergeant with B Company, who was one of the other platoons that came with us, they'd come across from the other bridge to reinforce our side. And he let these tanks get almost right on top. And he, as Wagger said, and I'm in touch with him still, we still correspond, he said he was frightened to death and he didn't know what to do, but he just aimed this thing and pulled the trigger, and this tank literally blew up. It was quite amazing. It went off with a big bang, and all these yellow and orange and blue and all these colours and all this tracer and stuff started going up in the sky, and there were these guys in the tank jumping out and screaming because they were burning, and the damn thing was blowing up, and we hit it with one shot from this little Piat.
Just to the east of Pegasus, British paratroopers succeeded in blowing up the remaining bridges. Normandy was now virtually cut off from reinforcement from the German divisions to the east and the Pas-de-Calais.
We saw from observations that the bridges were not occupied by the Germans, and we went down to the village of Bure, where the 3rd Parachute Squadron engineers had already arrived with their demolition explosives, and we covered them, not as we protected them, or helped to protect them, whilst they were laying their charges on the bridges. But they were quite difficult bridges to demolish because they were made of steel girders.
But the airborne troops would have to hold out for many more hours as the Allied armada was barely halfway across the Channel. Their progress would be greatly hampered if the guns in the flank coastal batteries were not silenced. Again, it was the task of the airborne forces to remove this threat. One of the things that worried Allied planners was the presence of powerful German coastal batteries on either side of the flanks of the invasion beaches. Batteries that could shoot in across the beaches and make that final 1,000 yards of the run to shore very dangerous indeed. Here at Merville, on the east flank, the British flank, the RAF reconnaissance teams thought they'd spotted a German coastal battery at Merville, tucked well back from the coast, with observers on the coast able to shoot out to sea. The task of destroying this battery was given to Colonel Terence Otway and the men of 9 Parachute Battalion.
When I was given the task of capturing the Merville battery early in 1944, I realized it was going to be a very complicated operation and a very tough one. We were jumping over the Atlantic Wall in order to land outside another fortress. And we were going to drop and move up to the attack at night. So I determined that every single man, from the most senior officer down to the youngest and junior private, must know exactly what he and everybody else was doing. With the use of air photographs and models, I decided to construct a replica of the battery over ground as similar as possible to what we could see on the air photographs. And the staff found a place at Inkpen in Berkshire where there's an 800-foot hill so that we could use live ammunition. With the help of the Royal Engineers, we constructed the approach as near as possible. That is to say, if there was a ditch on the photograph, it wasn't in Berkshire, we made the ditch. If there was a stile, we made the stile. And we rehearsed that operation 9 times. And then when we went into the transit camp where we would there for 10 days, locked up inside before we took off. They went through the whole thing again on models and aircraft.
However, sadly, on the night of the drop, it all went horribly wrong. The RAF pilots were inexperienced, and as the German flak came up, they dived and weaved their Dakotas. All the paratroopers in the back were thrown to the floor. Those that did drop were scattered over miles of flooded plains. About 2 o'clock in the morning, here at the Merville Battery, Colonel Otway rallied only 150 men of the 600 who trained for the mission. Nonetheless, he decided to go ahead with the attack. Under cover of a diversion at the main gate, he blew a hole in the barbed wire and 9 para charged into the battery. Here in the dark, a bloody old-fashioned fight took place with grenades and butt and bayonet and boot. And as dawn broke, the paras were successful. With only 30 minutes to spare before the cruiser fire, designed to obliterate the battery, came in, Otway could signal to the sea, mission successful.
I gave the order to go in. I shouted, in fact, get in, get in. And they went in, yelling their heads off.
I was shouting, bastards, 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 and zigzagging down, and the ground was uneven, which might save your life. On my left, I momentarily heard shouts of mines, 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 and explosions.
The first men to go in that hit the apron fence, which is a barbed wire fence made like that, fell down on their face on top of it, and the others used them as a bridge going over, and then they got up and followed them.
We carried on firing, and there was crossfire. It was like running a gauntlet. You were lucky or not lucky. And suddenly, I reached the rear of the gun, and we threw a couple of grenades in there, and the Germans pushed each other out, shouting, Rusky, Rusky, Rusky. We handed the prisoners over, and then it was sort of mopping up, carrying our wounded out, or pulling them out on sledges, which were on site. I didn't know what these sledges were there for, and I later learned they were there for carting ammunition.
Of the German garrison, only 22 were left, and of the 600 men of 9 parachute battalion who trained for this vital mission, only 80 were left standing here at the Merville Battery. The Point du Hoc is almost the centre of the invasion beaches, and today the dimpled landscape is evidence of the enormous effort and sacrifice that went into bombing and trying to silence this critical battery. Allied intelligence was well aware of the threat posed by these coastal batteries on the Normandy coast. One of the most formidable, over my left shoulder, was the one at Point du Hoc. That had 6 155mm guns. That's a big gun, and it could shoot 15 to 20 miles out that way. Perhaps more dangerously, it could shoot right across Omaha Beach, out to the far headland. The task of seizing the Point du Hoc was given to the 2nd Rangers, and they, like quite a lot of other soldiers on D-Day, found that the tide had pushed them along the coast, and they landed about 400 yards from their objective. Undeterred, they trudged back under the cliff face and put the ladders they'd brought to help them scramble up. To their irritation, they discovered that the ladders were too short. They also discovered the German defenders, who were now pretty well aware of what was going on, were rolling down fuse shells and hand grenades. It was a bit of a struggle, and the Rangers took a lot of casualties at that point, but undeterred, they began to scramble up the cliff face with knives and ropes and try and fight their way to the top.
My radio man, he had a 300 set, which weighs about 50 pounds with a long aerial on it, and he was running out of strength at the top of the cliff. He was maybe 5 feet from the top, and he said to me, I was on the next rope next to him, Len, help me, I'm running out of strength, I'm going to fall. I said, Bob, I can't. It was Bob Fruling. I can't help you because I'm running out of steam too. Don't forget, at this point in time, they're shooting at us and trying to cut our ropes and trying to make us fall. But one of my other men, Len Rubin, he was built like a gorilla, a very powerful man, and he happened to be right just a few feet away, and I yelled, Rube, help Bob, his strength is giving out, and he grabbed Bob by the back of the neck, and he was such a powerful man, he sort of flung him or grabbed him and threw him over the top of the cliff, and he went rolling with the aerial whipping around, and fortunately made it through the help of Len Rubin getting over, and I got over on my own.
At that point, two things happened which helped the Rangers enormously. First, a bombing raid that no one had been expecting came in and blew the German defenders on the top of the cliff back under cover. And two destroyers, a British and an American, came in and at very close range blasted the German bunkers. The Germans took cover, the Rangers scrambled to the top of the cliff and rushed the gun emplacements. To their astonishment, they found they were empty. The Germans had pulled the guns back into some orchards behind up the cliffs several days before to avoid Allied bombing. They then found to their horror that they were on top of the cliff, surrounded by angry Germans and cut off. For the next 24 hours, the Rangers had to fight a desperate battle in all-round defence for their own survival, and it was only when the Germans withdrew 24 hours later that they were rescued. This action at Pont du Hoc cost Second Rangers dear. Of the 225 men that landed on the beach, 36 hours later, only 90 were left standing. That's a casualty rate of 60%, the worst on D-Day. At the western end of the invasion beaches, American airborne forces were also making their presence felt. The vital task of defending the western flank of the invasion beaches was given to the US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their mission was quite straightforward. They had to seal off the Route Nationale 13 that comes down from the Cotentin Peninsula and stop any German reinforcements coming down and plunging into the flank of the invasion beaches. Their secondary task was, if possible, to push up and link up with the US forces as they landed and clear the beaches. The drop went horribly wrong from the start. The aeroplanes were scattered all over the sky, and as a result, the paratroopers were scattered all over the ground.
On each side of the river, it was a mucky mess, all right, quite swampy. Many men had dropped into it, many men had come out of it. With all that combat gear on there, and as tight as you keep your harness, it's not that easy to get out of a chute just prior to landing in water.
I've talked to some fellows from the 505, for example, landed in there, but there was a railroad track went across, and luckily a lot of them got up onto the railroad track. If that hadn't been there, there'd been a lot more of them drowned, I think.
In the dark and confusion, the soldiers had a terrible problem. How could they find their comrades and link up for an attack? Despite all the technology of war, all the effort that went into the Overlord invasion, a simple child's toy, a clicker, did the job. As a result, the American paratroopers were able to link up in the dark, and they put in a very successful attack here at Saint-Mary-Église and blocked the N13. By dawn, the town had been secured, and even a German armoured counterattack pushing in at La Fière from the south had been stopped. Saint-Mary-Église had been secured. For the 101st, however, it didn't go quite so well. By dawn, they'd got 1,500 out of 6,000 soldiers only here, concentrated to the north. Despite this, they pushed up and linked up with the US forces as they came ashore. And for the defenders here of Saint-Mary-Église, late on D-Day, the happiest sound in the world must have been the noise of the American tanks rumbling in from the beach to link up and secure this whole area. By the end of D-Day, at Saint-Mary-Église, the whole western flank of the D-Day invasion had been secured. As daylight began to lighten the sky to the east, the invasion armada approached the Normandy beaches.
When daylight came on the 6th, I mean, I could look back and there was this absolute mass of shipping, you know, behind us. I mean, we were in front, obviously. And one just looked and one couldn't believe the size of the operation. I mean, everywhere there were boats of all description, destroyers, and, you know, and aircraft were coming over too.
The arrival of the Allied shipping off the Normandy coast was announced with a thunderous barrage by the guns of the battleships. It was a welcome sound for the men already ashore, for whom D-Day had already begun.
Well, we were aware that something was happening about the time we went down about 6 a.m. to view it, because there was a tremendous noise. I'd never heard anything like it before. When the battleships fired their broadsides. So it sounded like a noise rather similar to an express train coming out of a tunnel. And the sky was black with smoke, and and then there was bombing going on. There was obviously something going on, but with no means of knowing whether the landings had been successful or not, because remembering what had happened at Dieppe when they were halted on the beaches. And we were up in this position in the woods where we're in a very strong defensive position, but very isolated.
At about 6:30 on the morning of June the 6th, the first assault troops scrambled down into their landing craft and headed for the Normandy shore, uncertain of the reception that awaited them.
Despite the heavy sea swell and the difficult conditions offshore, the landings here on the British sector, for example here at Gold Beach, were surprisingly successful. As the troops came ashore, they found that the opposition was patchy. Churchill had always feared, as he called it, another catastrophe like the Somme. He actually muttered to Montgomery, "I'm worried about the sea running red with blood." But that didn't happen here. The casualties were relatively light in the British sector. One of the reasons for this was the impact of the swimming tanks, Hobart's funnies. Now, the Germans had actually got quite a spirited defence on this beach, mainly based around 88mm anti-tank guns firing down and machine gun posts. But as the swimming tanks came ashore, they dropped their skirts that enabled them to float and immediately took on these positions at very close range with their 75mm guns. The result was the opposition was blown away and the assaulting infantry could pour up these ridges here and get on the high ground overlooking the beach. The upshot was that by lunchtime, Gold Beach was pretty well clear. The advance inland had started. For example, the Green Howards here had pushed on to the next objective, and the follow-up waves were beginning to come up the beach. Among them was another armoured regiment, the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, and their target was to head inland for Bayeux. This is Omaha Beach. It's a gentle, curving stretch of sand, 7,000 yards long. It's overlooked by high cliffs on either side and on the beach itself. It's a very attractive place to invade France. The slope's easy, and once you're here, it's only a very, very short bound to get the key road that runs behind the coast. Now, the defenders here were perfectly aware of the attractiveness of this beach to any invading force. And so the German defences here at Omaha were much stronger than anywhere else on the whole invasion front. The key to the defence of Omaha Beach are the 5 little valleys or draws leading off the beach. And the Germans had reinforced these. They had up to 35 pillboxes, machine gun posts, even big guns here, held in by barbed wire and ready to defend anyone coming on this beach. The 2 American divisions who landed here, the United States Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division, and the 29th Division, had actually decided that they would launch their duplex drive swimming tanks a long way out. The tide was running down, the waves were high, they were all sunk. And so when the landing craft hit the beach here, the ramps went down, nothing happened at first. However, as they began to trudge through the water and get onto the beach, all hell broke loose. A German corporal said later that he'd been given orders by his officer to wait until you can see the invaders up to their knees in the water, then open fire. The blizzard of machine gun fire cut the American invaders down. It was almost like a First World War battle here. Hundreds of men went down in the water immediately. The survivors, seasick and frightened, ran for the seawall, and they huddled behind it, trying to work out what to do next, listening to the screams of their wounded comrades here.
They had a position, a pillbox right down on the water's edge, and you could be a blind man and fire up and down that beach and just hit anybody. And he was just raking that beach up and down and up and down, and so many of the men were getting hit from the side.
This was not a good place to be on the morning of the 6th of June 1944, because from both flanks the German defenders had a clear view and could fire down the beach. And if you tried to get over the top and go forward, you ran straight into the German defences. At one point, all order broke down here, and it looked very much as if the invasion would fail at Omaha. However, during the morning, more officers arrived. Small groups of brave, determined men began to go forward. They began to get explosives out there. They began to get bulldozers, and gradually, as the afternoon wore on, they fought their way very hard inland, up the draw, and eventually escaped. But as they looked back, they could see bodies floating in the water red with blood here at Omaha, and they could hear the screams of drowning men who couldn't be rescued.
When we left the beach, we came under very heavy shelling at that point. And I crawled into one of the hedgerows for shelter, and really cringing from all this heavy shell fire that we're taking, and I heard a bird singing, and I turned and looked, and sure enough, there was a little bird singing away to his heart's content, and I thought to myself, my goodness, you're in danger too. What's the matter with you? Here I was sure that my end was near, and here's a bird singing his head off. Amazing thing.
Thousands of men died here at Omaha Beach, and that's why it's known as Bloody Omaha.
The first sight I had of the beach was, I was amazed at how far it was, how wide open it was, what a distance we had to travel to come into the first area that would any kind of cover. I left a lot of good people there on the beach.
This little valley is one of the exits from Omaha, and as the American infantry struggled ashore and fought their way up this little valley, they found themselves immediately plunged into a firefight with the German defenders, struggling for their very lives. And even when the Americans were able to whistle up some of their tanks, which had landed, they found in their turn that they too were being ambushed and cut to ribbons by tank ambushers in this close country, perfect defensive country for anti-tank weapons. The problem is, it's the bocage. The bocage, this network of small fields and hedges, comes all the way down to the beaches here in the American sector. Unlike the British sector, where the first few miles are rolling open downland, very good for tanks. This bocage was going to have serious consequences in the weeks and months ahead. It would cause thousands of casualties, slow down the advance, and nearly wreck Montgomery's great plan for Operation Overlord. If Omaha Beach had been a bloody near failure, the landings here on Utah, the most westerly of the invasion beaches, could hardly have been more successful. There were several reasons for this. First of all, the defenders here were very widely spread. Utah Beach is a very long area to defend. The second reason was that many of the German defenders here were what the Wehrmacht called ear, nose and throat battalions. And those that weren't tended to be middle-aged men conscripted rather reluctantly to serve in Hitler's legions. Many of them had only had 8 weeks training. The third reason was good fire support here. The commander of the 4th US Division, on coming inshore, saw the waves were very high and ordered that the duplex drive swimming tanks were launched as late as possible. As a result, many of the tanks could actually come up the beach and help to fight the infantry in on these objectives. An added bonus was the presence of a US fighter bomber strike that came in just at the critical moment, obliterating the German defences in this sector. The result was the Germans were overwhelmed here, and even one of the defenders here, a young man called Lieutenant Juncker, who had the combat badge twice and actually held the Knight's Cross, the Iron Cross, that's the German equivalent of the Victoria Cross, found by lunchtime that all his guns were knocked out, many of his men were killed or wounded, they were surrounded, he had no option but to surrender. The consequence was that the United States 4th Division could drive south quickly and link up with the US airborne forces out there to the south at Saint-Mary-Glise. By the end of the day, here at Utah Beach, 23,000 men had come ashore, supplies were flowing, and no less than 1,700 tanks, vehicles and guns were pouring ashore. The right flank of the invasion had been secured. Operation Overlord was not going to be taken in flank by the Germans on the Cotentin Peninsula.
Although the British forces had initially met fairly light resistance on the beaches, it wasn't long before they began encountering much more determined defence.
Some parts of Hitler's Atlantic Wall did their job very well indeed. Despite the thousands of bombs and shells that had been rained on this particular complex, which was nicknamed the Hillman Bunker, no impression was made on this solid concrete edifice. It was the command post of Colonel Krug and the 736th Grenadier Regiment, and their task was to hold everyone off this high ground and stop them coming off the beach. When the Suffolks advanced up here, the short bound from the beach, they found themselves coming under a blizzard of well-aimed machine gun fire. It was almost like a First World War battle. And although the Suffolks whistled up a Sherman tank, which had just come off the beach, its 75mm gun could make very little impression against these concrete emplacements. The result was that Hillman, the bunker, was able to cause serious casualties to the infantry battalions advancing on either side. In fact, they caused 150 casualties alone to the Norfolks on D-Day. Now, although the bunker surrendered the next day, D+1, and Colonel Krug and his 70 survivors fell into British hands, the delay they had inflicted was absolutely crucial. The day's delay here meant that Caen, a key objective, was not taken on the first day. And that setback to Montgomery's plan was to have serious consequences in the days and the weeks ahead.
But where was the feared German armour? Rommel, convinced there was no danger of invasion, had gone home to celebrate his wife's birthday. Many other senior officers were attending a War Games summit in Brittany. Ironically, the scenario under study by the German General Staff was the possibilities and options for an Allied invasion in Normandy. As word filtered through the German command structure that the landings were actually taking place, there was hesitation as to what to do next. Hitler, 1,000 miles to the east, was asleep and didn't like to be roused. Therefore, it was not until midday that he was able to authorise the release of the panzer divisions.
Once the assault troops had consolidated on the beaches back there, they began to push inland and exploit and take ground. And by about noon, the British 3rd Division off Sword Beach had taken this vital ridge, the Perrier Ridge. It's a crucial piece of high ground because from here you can see the sea very clearly, but you can also see the town of Caen. Now, Caen was one of the first day objectives, and it was vital for Montgomery's plan that he did actually seize and hold the town. Now, Caen was defended by 21 Panzer Division. 21 Panzer Division was an elite formation. It had fought in the Afrika Corps under Rommel, and it was equipped with 90 Mark IV tanks. Unfortunately, when the British paratroops landed at Ronville and Pegasus early in the morning, the infantry of 21 Panzer had been committed to deal with them and was actually engaged in combat with them at the time the news came through that the Allies' main landing was actually here on the beaches of Normandy. A furious row then ensued in the German High Command. General Marx, the Corps commander, ordered the division to turn around and go back through Caen, come up this way, and he actually gave orders to push the British into the sea, because if we don't, he said to one of the battle group commanders, we have lost the war. Prophetic words. The result was 21 Panzer struggled through Caen, through the suburbs, all through the late morning and afternoon of the 6th of June. It wasn't until 4 o'clock that they managed to get into this hollow here and make a concerted counterattack on the British on Perrier Ridge. But by then it was too late. The British had dug in a number of their new 17-pounder heavy anti-tank guns, the British equivalent of the feared German 88mm. And this time it was the German tanks that took a pounding. As the Panzers had marched up the hill, 6 of them were knocked out in quick succession by the 17-pounders. Shortly after, another 9 were knocked out over there. The result was 21 Panzers' counterattack stalled completely. One small battle group managed to struggle through to the sea at Lyons-sur-Mer, but at dusk they were unsupported, they were surrounded and fell back. The counterattack, Rommel's desire to drive the British into the sea and get rid of the landings in the first day, had failed completely. It's a classic example of the military adage, order, counter-order, you then get disorder. However, for the British this was a hollow victory, because Caen, the first day's objective, the promised land not far away there, was not to fall for over a month.
So by the end of D-Day, The Allies had the slenderest of toeholds on the continent, but they were ashore and consolidating. The American 7th Corps had landed on Utah Beach and were pushing inland, but they began to meet stiff resistance at Corentin. It would take until the 12th of June, 6 whole days, before they were able to link up with the American 5th Corps that had landed and taken such a pounding on Omaha Beach. On the eastern side of the bridgehead, the British and Canadians had fared better in some sectors, less well in others.
Once the Allies were ashore, they wanted to push inland as fast as they could to expand and consolidate the bridgehead. The advance was surprisingly rapid, particularly here in the British sector, where this good rolling tank country means that the army could push ahead very quickly. For example, the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, which swam ashore on D-Day, found themselves next morning 5 miles inland as the liberators of Bayeux, the first major French town to be liberated. Things began to go wrong about 3 days later. Rommel had swung 2 of his crack panzer divisions south of Caen to mask off what he recognised was an important British objective. At Tilly-sur-Seine on the 9th of June, the Rangers ran into the well-dug-in veterans of the Panzerlehr Division. Their tanks were no match for the German Panthers, and casualties were very heavy. Among them was the second in command of A Squadron of the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, Keith Douglas, arguably the best war poet of the Second World War. He, like many other victims of the armoured battles in Normandy, lies buried in Tilly Cemetery, not far from where he was killed. On his grave, the poignant inscription, Keith Douglas, poet, artist. These things he loved. He died for their defence.
But the German defences were strengthening by the day. Caen was firmly in German hands, as was the area to the south and southeast of the city. In the tense weeks that followed the landing, every attempt to push the Germans back was paid for in blood.
We got into Esquiville, and there was a big chateau on the north side of the village with beautiful park-like grounds, and we got in there and we were sort of standing around and all sort of thinking, God, no fight at all. I don't know why intelligence said we were going to be in trouble trying to get this place. There's no Germans around the damn place, and all of a sudden everything opened up. They had tanks, there was high ground on the south side, and they had these tanks with literally just their guns sticking over the top of the ground, and they were dug in, hull down. They opened up. German machine guns, German snipers, they fired mortars, and there was us out in this damn middle of this park with little trees that were no good. We had shells bursting in the trees, and they were sort of showering shrapnel down on top of us. You couldn't lay down, because if you did, you got more of a target with the shrapnel, and it was dodgy to stand up because they were firing machine guns and snipers. So, you know, we sort of charged forward and took a dive behind the front wall of the chateau, which was only about 5 or 6 feet, or 5 foot high, and we were sheltering underneath that. And one of our anti-tank guns came up and put itself in the gateway, and it was sort of swiveling around looking for one of these German 88mm self-propelled to shoot at, or tank, whatever it was, and the tank suddenly fired, and the whole thing disappeared in a big cloud of dust, blue smoke, and that was it. There was no more anti-tank gun and no more men. They were wiped out. And I crawled along there to that gate where they were, and I looked round the corner, and coming down the track there was a constant stream, hundreds of these Germans coming down, and I was so I thought, God, we've had it. You know, there's no way we can't get back across that park. It's too open. And I pulled a grenade out of my thing, and I was in such a panic seeing all these bloody Germans. I'd never seen so many Germans close up, and I was such a panic. I fumbled it, dropped the damn grenade after I pulled the pin, and then I had to grab it quick, and then I lobbed it over. And you can only throw those things about a cricket pitch length, 24 feet. And I lobbed this, and I shouted to some of the others. I said, get some grenades over there, and 2 or 3 of the others threw grenades. And then we fired up and started firing from the hip, and these Germans were coming at us firing from the hip as well as they came down, and it was a right old melee. And then we said, right, there's no way we stay standing up round here with no shelter or anything. So we said, well, we'll get down and crawl back. And our section, I think there was 6, 7 of us that I was with, and we started crawling Indian fashion across this park, and we had literally, you could see the bullets chipping the trees just above your head as you passed them, and they were cutting little chips out of the trees, and they were literally so close to where we were coming along the ground. You know, you knew that they were actually, if you even raised your
ahead a few inches, you get it shot off.
As the British armour pushed south inland from the coast, they found themselves increasingly in country like this. This is the bocage, the classic Norman system of surrounding every field with a high earth wall and topping it with a thick hedge. It's perfect defensive country. Every bush is a potential ambush, every corner a potential trap. The tanks slowed down. They couldn't advance. The only way you can clear this kind of countryside is with infantry. The Germans, however, had two superlative weapons to help them in their fight to hold back the British and all the Allies in this bocage country. The first was the Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon that turned every German anti-tank man potentially into a tank killer. At 25 yards range, a brave Panzer Grenadier could stop a British armoured division in its tracks. And once it's stopped in a narrow defile like this, there's nothing anyone can do about it. The second weapon they had was the Spandau machine gun, which is probably the best machine gun of the Second World War. Belt-fed, lightweight, air-cooled, it could rip out 1,200 rounds a minute. And the British infantry in Normandy came to dread the brr, brr of the Spandau, and occasionally the reply of their own Bren guns, much slower, boop, 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 boop. The attack stalled and was held up here in the bocage, and Montgomery's plan and the whole of the breakout from the invasion beaches was in deep trouble.
Dreadful. I mean, it was thick bocage country, which is, you know, high hedges and ditches and very small fields, all bordered by these hedges. Wonderful country to defend, but terrible to attack, particularly as, you know, we were outgunned. And not so bad from the point of view of the infantry, because, I mean, they had a certain amount of protection. But nevertheless, I mean, you know, the Germans certainly had a big advantage right from the start in that sort of country. And because one never knew from where any shot would come. I mean, whether in the form of a Panzerfaust or an anti-tank gun or a Tiger tank or whatever. So, you know, it was living dangerously. You know, I mean, a Panzerfaust could knock you out. Any of their guns could knock you out. So, I mean, it was the anticipation of this the whole time that made one feel very nervous.
The Americans were to find a partial solution to dealing with the bocage. A twin-pronged plough was fitted to the front of the ubiquitous Sherman tank. Christened the Rhinoceros, these tanks were designed to charge and tear at the high hedges and earth banks and pull them apart. It was crude, but it worked.
Following the failure of the disastrous Canadian raid on Dieppe in the middle of 1942, it was quite clear that the Allies were going to find it very hard to capture a well-defended port on the northern coast of France. So if they were going to invade France, they were going to have to take their own. In the middle of June 1943, a very ambitious engineering project began. It was to construct two massive artificial harbours that could be floated across the channel and used to support the invasion. One for the American front, one for the British front. The whole project were called the Mulberry Harbours. The idea was really very simple. There'd be an outer line of 60 old ships which would be sunk to form a breakwater. Inside that, massive concrete boxes, empty boxes called caissons, some as big as 4,000 tons, were sunk on the seabed and joined up as piers by 7 miles of floating roadway that would go up and down with a tide of 22 feet here, a huge tide. The idea was a brilliant success. 2 days after the invasion, the Mulberries were in operation, and less than a week after the operation, on the 12th of June, they'd already brought in 320,000 men, 116,000 tons of stores, and no less than 54,000 tanks, vehicles and guns. It was a huge and successful project. However, it all went wrong, sadly, on the 3rd week of June, when a gale blew up the channel and damaged both the Mulberries. The American one so badly it had to be abandoned. All effort was concentrated here on the British Mulberry at Arromanches, and it was in operation until the 1st of December 1944, when it was bringing in an average of 7,500 tons of stores every day for 6 months. It was a remarkable tribute to the imagination, the skill, and the sheer engineering power of the Allied effort to land stores and reinforce the invasion of Normandy.
Getting fuel to the Allied forces was another concern that was addressed by creating Force Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Deep-sea tugs followed the invasion fleet across the channel, slowly unwinding reels of pipe. On the Isle of Wight, powerful pumps housed in an old fort and amusement park ensured that fuel was pumped and on tap throughout the Normandy campaign. Nearly 800 miles of pipes were laid, enough to provide the plumbing for 50,000 new houses when the pipes were ultimately salvaged after the war. It was just as well that the Allied planners had decided to take everything with them, because, despite the enormous effort, Cherbourg, the nearest large port to the invasion beaches, was held by the Germans until the 28th of June. Even when it fell, it was found that the Germans had disabled the port to such an extent that it couldn't be used for months. The Americans began the task of clearing the port immediately. In the British sector, the invasion had virtually ground to a halt. Although the Allies enjoyed total air superiority, German armour was managing to contain the bridgehead, preventing any breakout.
This is Villers-Bocage. Nowadays it's hard to imagine that 60 years ago this quiet, sleepy French provincial town was the scene of one of the bitterest battles in Normandy. Moreover, it was a battle that was to prove a serious setback for the British and stop any hopes of a quick breakout from the beachhead. What happened was this. Montgomery decided to pinch out Caen after the setback at Tilly. He was going to put 51st Highland Division on the east side and 7th Armoured on the west. Both these formations had fought in the Western Desert and had a high opinion of themselves. In fact, 7th Armoured, the Desert Rats, grumbled, saying that they should have been in the first wave of the attack. Montgomery, in his usual crisp fashion, said, "You don't put your best batsman in first." Well, the battle at Villers-Bocage was to prove that perhaps 7th Armoured were no longer in the first-team league. The attack to the east by 51st Highland soon came unglued. They ran into reinforced German defences, the Jocks were cut down, one of the Black Watch battalions lost 200 men in the morning, and the attack stalled, faltered and failed. Further to the west, however, 7th Armoured found a gap in the German line on the 12th of June, and on the morning of the 13th, they'd begun to swing round to the southeast and pour up this road, heading towards Caen. They stopped here in the middle of Villers-Bocage, nose to tail, a line of tanks, armoured carriers and men, all waiting while a squadron of tanks pushed them up the road to see if the way was clear. The soldiers got out of their personnel carriers and tanks, they sat down by the side of the road and began to brew up their breakfast tea. Disaster was about to befall. Waiting behind a screen of trees, about 250 yards over there, was an SS tank commander, Captain Michael Wittmann, and his 5 heavy Tiger tanks. They were watching with astonishment at this sight of a line of static British armoured vehicles nose to tail on the road, the soldiers getting out, brewing up tea. His driver says, "The Tommies are behaving as if they've won the war already, sir." And Wittmann put his binoculars down and said, "We're going to teach them that they haven't." Thus began one of the most dramatic tank actions of the Second World War. Wittmann's first action was to move down there to the end of the column and slam 2 88mm shells into the 2 tanks at the end of the line. He effectively then sealed the whole of the armoured column on this road. He then drove up and down the armoured column, shooting at every vehicle he saw, knocking them out. It was a scene of indescribable confusion. Ammunition was blowing up, wounded men were screaming, there was smoke and blood and flames everywhere. By lunchtime, the County of London Yeomanry had been completely wiped out as a fighting unit. Over 30 armoured vehicles were destroyed. As the day wore on, it became apparent that the great British armoured thrust up towards Caen had turned into the great British struggle for survival here. The armoured brigade, of which this regiment was the vanguard, was now surrounded by Panzerlehr as it closed in for the kill. And the next day, the British were forced to withdraw, very much licking their wounds, leaving hundreds of dead behind and dozens of burning armoured vehicles. It proved beyond doubt that the Tiger tank was the king of the battlefield here in Normandy. Further up the column, the nightmare continued. Up here was the Rifle Brigade, the Mechanised Infantry Battalion, packed nose to tail in the half-tracks. They couldn't go forward and they couldn't go back. To their horror, they saw the big Tiger tank of Wittmann coming up the hill towards them, shooting at everything in sight. There was absolutely nothing they could do about it, and they began to take heavy casualties. Some men tried to organise a defence. They were cut down. Armoured vehicles were exploding. Eventually, they had to bug out. Those that could fled. Those that couldn't took cover in the ditch and were promptly machine-gunned by Wittmann.
But Wittmann did not survive the Normandy campaign. The greatest tank ace of the war fell victim, like so many of his comrades, to the firepower of Royal Air Force Typhoons. The firepower of the Panther and Tiger tanks were of concern to Allied commanders because they were worried that their own tank crews would begin to believe that these Leviathans really were invincible and so avoid contact. By comparison, the Sherman tank was very flimsy, but it had the speed and manoeuvrability that most of the German tanks lacked.
I don't think I thought in terms of it being, a bad weapon. I mean, it was a good weapon. And the advantage we had over the Germans, if any, was the fact that we had more tanks than they did. I mean, we couldn't knock them out. I mean, they could knock us out very, very easily. But, if you have one dug-in Tiger tank and they're up against 15 Shermans, I mean, you've got a chance of getting round it for a start. I mean, you might lose 2 or 3 in the process, but... and also, of course, we had air support, if required, to shift the damn thing. So we weren't at a complete disadvantage. But from the point of view of firepower, in numbers we had an advantage, but in terms of, being able to knock out another tank, we were at a disadvantage.
The firepower problem was partially solved when the British Royal Armoured Corps began to replace the normal 75mm gun with a proven tiger-killing gun, the 17-pounder. Renamed the Sherman Firefly, the 17-pounder equipped tank crews now had a weapon, albeit in limited numbers, that could take the fight to the German tanks and win. The stalemate around Caen was now developing into a battle of attrition between the British and German armour.
We were up in these positions for 5 days, but Colonel Pearson, being a brilliant soldier, he had half the battalion out on patrol to the neighbouring areas at any one time, day or night, continual patrols. And this gave the impression to the Germans that there were about 2,000 men there instead of 300, and this ruse worked. We were not relieved, we were surrounded by the Germans for 5 days, until the 51st Highland Division joined up with us on the, what would that be, the, I think it was the 10th and 11th of June.
Every day, practically of the week, you'd hear somebody had copped it, somebody had been killed, somebody had been wounded, because we were sitting in these trenches, morning, noon and night. We were being mortared and shelled. Sometimes we were bombed by aircraft, not very often. We didn't see too much of the German aircraft, but in the main we were being bombarded by mortars, and these, a horrible thing that they had, which has got an unpronounceable name, we called it the Moaning Mini, and it was a thing that fired 6 drain pipes. You couldn't call them anything else. They were just like long, I think 6 foot, 7 foot long drain pipe, which were filled with bits of metal, all sorts of stuff, stones, God knows what didn't go into them. And they used to fire these up, and where the ordinary streamlined smooth shell used to come in like an express train, you'd hear it going as it went over the top. These things used to go up in the sky like rockets, 6 of them, and they'd spread out. And then they'd scream. They used to really make your blood curdle. It was just like the sort of howling of the banshees and the wind through telegraph wires in a gale, that sort of noise.
After the first fortnight in Normandy, the 6th Airborne Division was supposed to have been taken back to England because as specialist glider-borne and parachute troops were supposed to be part of the strategic reserve to be held there in case of trouble and not used as ordinary infantry, but they were so short of infantrymen in Normandy that they kept us out of there, but we were just more or less holding the forward positions in about the same line, same front line for about 2 months. And during this time we used to do a spell up in the front line, maybe a week or 10 days, in the same period down in the area near Pegasus Bridge where it wasn't quite as violent. But at any time, during the whole time we were down in this area, there was always the worry that you might suddenly be killed. And this is what people don't realise. I mean, they go through a major disaster these days and that's the end of it. They need counselling for weeks afterwards. We were getting major disasters all the time. And shelling and bombing and being shot at. And it is a tremendous strain.
With the end of the fighting at Villers-Bocage, the second phase of the Battle of Normandy was over. The first phase, the landing, had been extremely successful, and the second phase was really the Germans sealing off the last gap and containing the Allies in the bridgehead. General Montgomery now began the great plan to find a way of breaking out of the bridgehead and pushing out into the open ground behind to follow the great strategic plan to go for Paris and then on to Germany. And it's here, in this ground, southwest of Caen, on the 26th of June 1944, that Operation Epsom was launched. A huge attack, 60,000 men, 700 guns, designed to punch a hole in the German defences and break out to the south. At first, everything went extremely well. The divisions themselves were some of the best in the British Army, the 15th Scottish, the 11th Armoured and the 43rd Wessex. And they managed to push 3 miles forward until German resistance began to coalesce, the classic story in Normandy. Eventually, by the 29th of June, a battalion of Duke of Cornwall's light infantry fought themselves to this hill and this wood over here, Cornwall Wood. The Germans reacted to the loss of this feature, which is the most commanding piece of terrain for miles around. You can even see the sea over there, let alone Caen. They reacted with characteristic vigour. Rommel himself came forward and threw 2 newly transferred panzer divisions from the Eastern Front into the counterattack. No one knows just how many attacks the Cornwalls endured in that wood during the time they occupied it. We do know that at one point a Tiger tank in the dark blundered into the middle of the wood and actually knocked over a soldier's pot of tea. The incensed soldier cursed the tank commander. "What the bloody hell do you think you're doing?" And then realised to his horror that it was a German tank. He rushed off to get a Piat, but by then it was too late for Private Pipes to knock out the Tiger. The Tiger commander was probably equally scared and blundered off into the dark. By the morning of the 29th, it was quite clear they couldn't hold on any longer. And gradually, the Cornwalls drifted back off the hill. They'd taken 320 casualties and pulled back down towards the line of the river. And General O'Connor, the Corps commander, very wisely decided to pull the troops back off this hill as well. They all withdrew north of the Odon, and by the 1st of July, Operation Epsom was over. Now, many people deem it a failure, and indeed, in terms of the great breakout, it was a failure. But in terms of the wider strategic picture, Operation Epsom was a great success in that it began to draw in the German armoured reserves to the eastern side, the British side of the bridgehead, leaving the way open and the door open for the great American counterattack that would break out later in the campaign.
As Operation Epsom ground to a halt, Operation Charnwood was launched to try and seal off Caen and capture the town. On the night of July the 7th, thousands of soldiers watched in amazement as wave after wave of Royal Air Force bombers droned low over the city and dropped their loads into an increasingly huge pall of smoke and flame. Resorting to the blunt instrument of bomber command reflected the increasing desperation that was beginning to take over the Allied High Command. As British troops entered the city of Caen the following morning, they were greeted by a scene of total devastation and destruction. Thousands of French civilians had been killed, and those that remained were too frightened to leave their cellars and places of refuge. But the Allied troops only got as far as the north bank of the Orne River. The Germans still held the critical high ground of the Bourgebus Ridge to the south of the city. But the Germans were also suffering badly from this battle of attrition. Their bitter defence was soaking up men and equipment that could never be replaced. All the while, in his headquarters, immediately behind the front line, Montgomery remained upbeat about the campaign's progress.
It was here, south of Caen, on the 18th of July, that Montgomery launched the biggest British armoured offensive of the war. The plan, Operation Goodwood, was really very simple, brutally simple. The idea was that a complete British armoured corps of 3 armoured divisions, the British by this time outnumbered the Germans 4-1 in tanks, would smash through here in this open country and ride through the German defences, pushing on south to Falaise and the breakout. The whole thing was to be preceded by a huge aerial bombardment that would blast the German defences away. However, this time, something went badly wrong. For once, British intelligence, relying heavily on code breaking, didn't actually spot anything about the German defences. Conversely, the Germans, for once, had very good intelligence of the British build-up of armour over there. They knew exactly what was coming, and 2 days before the battle actually alerted the defenders. However, at 7:30 on the 18th of July, the waves of bombers came overhead. They crashed their bombs into this whole ridge behind me here, and the attacking forces couldn't have been happier. They actually saw whole German tanks being blown in the air. It looked as if it was going to be a walkover. At 7:30, the attack went in, following up the bombing. At first, as so often in Normandy, everything went very well. However, things began to go very badly wrong as the German defence coalesced and began to pick off the British tanks. For example, down here in the village of Cagny, Colonel Hans von Luck of 21st Panzer found 4 surviving 88mm anti-aircraft guns. He invited the officer in charge to fire at the advancing British tanks. The officer declined, pointing out that he was an anti-aircraft gunner. Von Luck drew his pistol, cocked it, and said, "You can either be a dead anti-aircraft gunner or a live anti-tank hero." The anti-aircraft officer wisely complied and actually knocked out very quickly 9 of 11 armoured divisions' tanks as they advanced across this open ground behind. Casualties were very heavy indeed for the armour. This whole area was littered with burning tanks, men coming back, and smoke was boiling across the ground. Corporal Peter Roach was commanding a British armoured car, and as it was driving across this ground here, it was hit by a German anti-tank shell. He leapt out and saw his driver, who'd had his head out of the turret, was wounded in the head. They pulled him out, and to his horror, Peter Roach found the man's blood and brains on his hands as he died by the side of the road. Later in the day, when he was drinking a cup of tea at the end of what must have been a shattering experience, Peter Roach noticed the dried blood and brains on his hands. And that was the story of the day completely. The German defences stopped the attack dead. Men drifted back, and within 2 days, the whole attack, Goodwood, had been pulled off. Goodwood was a bitter disappointment for the Allies. Montgomery's reputation was shattered. This was no longer the breakout. The RAF, squabbling bitterly with the army command here, were even more estranged. Relations between the army and the RAF reached an all-time low at this point. Forward air control had broken down. The officers in charge weren't even speaking to each other. The Americans more and more began to disregard Montgomery and rely on their own chain of command. But one very important thing came out of the failure of Goodwood. The Germans were extremely alarmed, yet again, at this pressure on the eastern sector, and they began to draw off more and more of their reserves to shore up their defences here against the British. That had the effect of thinning out the defences out there to the west. And out there to the west of the bridgehead, the United States Army and Air Force were massing its forces for the great breakout that was going to come just a week later, Operation Cobra at Saint-Lô. The door to victory was open.
The Americans now faced a front almost completely denuded of German armour. They also enjoyed a substantial superiority in tank and infantry divisions, thanks now to the reinforcements flooding in. They also had an air force with the bombardment power to devastate any German defences in their path. Operation Cobra was scheduled to begin on the 25th of July. The offensive opened with a devastating bombing campaign, many of the bombs also landing on the waiting GIs. A gap now opened through which the US First Army sped, taking Avranches on the 30th of July. At this point, the newly formed US Third Army, under a rehabilitated General Patton, now joined the advance. The advance through Brittany was rapid, culminating in the capture of Rennes, the regional capital. Following the capture of Rennes, Patton's Third Army hooked left back towards central France. A massive American armoured spearhead now threatened to encircle the Germans in Normandy from the rear. But the Germans still found the will to fight back. In a desperate bid to split the Allies' bridgehead, Hitler ordered that as many panzers as could be spared should be assembled for a counteroffensive. On the night of the 6th of August, the German armour attacked at Mortagne with the aim of pushing through to the coast at Avranches. But German signals had been intercepted, and so the American forces were lying in wait for the panzers. Operation Lüttich ended in a costly failure for the Germans as they lost yet more of their irreplaceable tanks. To make matters worse, they were now without their staunch defender Rommel. On the 17th of July, his car had been strafed by an RAF Spitfire. He escaped with his life, but he suffered such severe head injuries that he never really recovered. By October, Rommel was dead, having been implicated in the bomb plot hatched by disaffected officers to get rid of Hitler and begin peace negotiations with the Allies. On the 16th of August, the invasion of the south of France began. Codenamed Operation Dragoon, airborne and sea landings were launched in the area around Saint-Maxime. There was little resistance, and very soon the American forces were pushing north. In Normandy, pressure on the Germans was now reaching an inevitable climax. A renewed British offensive west of Caen, coupled with the developing American encirclement eastwards from Brittany, now meant that the German army was all but trapped in a huge pocket near Falaise. Hitler for once recognised the inevitable and gave permission for a withdrawal from Normandy. The only escape route for the Germans was a gap between the British and American forces closing in on Falaise. The retreating German columns made easy targets for roaming Allied aircraft as the jaws of the trap tightened. But despite the desperate conditions, nearly 250,000 men managed to escape from the trap between the 16th and the 19th of August, albeit without any of their equipment. The Germans left behind 50,000 dead and 200,000 prisoners of war. For 3 hard months, the Allies had fought and been bogged down in Normandy, but within a week, they were being hailed as liberators in Paris. The recently arrived Free French 2nd Armoured Division was given the honour of liberating the city. And on the 25th of August, the German commander of Paris surrendered to the resistance and 2nd Armoured's commander, General Leclerc. D-Day had been a stunning success, and by early September, all but a tiny fraction of France had been liberated from the Germans. Allied forces had occupied Belgium and part of the Netherlands, and in some places even reached the German frontier. But supply lines had become overstrained and lacked the strength to launch the one final campaign that could bring the war in Europe to a close. One of the coldest winters in history saw much hard fighting, especially during the Germans' last desperate effort, their counteroffensive in the Ardennes. It was not until the following May that Field Marshal Montgomery finally took the surrender of all the German armies in the West.